Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. Sometime in the early 1930s, a school group descended into an underground temple on the island of Malta. There was a teacher, there was a guide. There were approximately 30 children. They went into the lower passages of a 6,000-year-old carved limestone complex, 36 feet beneath the streets of Paola, following their guide deeper than the standard tour route. They did not come back out. A Maltese newspaper published an account of the incident. Official records from the period contain gaps that researchers have never been able to explain. The Maltese authorities restricted access to the deepest portions of the site shortly afterward. The passage the children followed is sealed. It has not been reopened. Officially, this story is a legend. But here is what is also true. Nobody has gone back in to prove it wrong. This is the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, and it is one of the most restricted archaeological sites in the world for reasons that have never been coherently explained. Carved into living limestone beneath the Maltese neighborhood of Paola, between approximately 3600 and 2500 BCE, the hypogeum is 6,000 years old, predating the Egyptian pyramids, predating Stonehenge, predating every civilization you were taught to consider ancient. It contains 3 levels of chambers, passages, and carved niches, extending 36 feet below street level. When excavated, the remains of approximately 7,000 human beings were found inside. Not buried in individual graves. Not arranged in family groups. Accumulated, commingled, dense as if the hypogeum received a civilization's worth of dead over centuries, or as if the dead arrived through some process that had nothing to do with ordinary burial. The 3rd level is where the documented failures begin. The officially accessible portions of the hypogeum are on the 1st and 2nd levels. The 2nd level contains the structure's most disturbing feature, a small rectangular chamber called the oracle's room. When a male voice speaks in a low register inside it, the resonance that results is not a standard echo. The chamber is carved to specific dimensions that produce resonance at 110 to 111 Hz, and at that frequency, research published by acoustic scientists, including studies affiliated with Princeton University, has found measurable shifts in human EEG readings. The brain moves from left hemisphere dominance analytical, critical, language-oriented to right hemisphere dominance. Critical thinking decreases, emotional processing increases. Susceptibility to suggestion increases. The oracle's room is a Stone Age device for altering human consciousness using geometry and sound. Whoever carved it 6,000 years ago understood exactly what that specific frequency does to the human brain, and they built it in. If the 2nd level contains a chamber engineered to alter consciousness, the question of what the 3rd level contains becomes considerably more urgent. The answer, officially, is that the 3rd level's further passages are structurally unstable and access would cause irreversible damage. This explanation has been in place since the 1930s, since right around the time a school group went in and didn't come back. Here's where it gets strange. The official position holds that the schoolchildren's story is a legend, an unverified account that circulated through a community unsettled by an unprecedented archaeological site beneath their feet. That's possible. But the Maltese records from the relevant period are incomplete. The access restrictions arrived in the same era, and the passage the group reportedly followed has not been reopened by any authority in any official capacity since. If it's only a legend, entering the passage and confirming it leads nowhere would close the question permanently. Nobody has done that. The authorities with the keys have chosen, for nearly a century, to leave the passage sealed rather than prove it empty. Ground surveys conducted in the 2000s detected acoustic and structural anomalies below the documented extent of the 3rd level, suggesting additional carved space at depth. The hypogeum sits inside a section of Malta where underground movement is geologically consistent with deep rock excavation. What lies below the currently mapped 3rd level, whether it extends further, where it goes, what's at the end, is not publicly documented. The mainstream explanation for the hypogeum frames it as a communal tomb and religious sanctuary. The oracle's room served ritual purposes. The acoustic effects are an interesting architectural feature. The sealed 3rd level passages are sealed for genuine preservation reasons. The schoolchildren's story is folklore. But 7,000 bodies in a single underground complex, accumulated over 1,000 years, is not a communal burial rate consistent with normal population mortality. and the oracle's room was not accidentally engineered to alter human consciousness. It was built to do exactly that, deliberately, by people who understood the effect precisely enough to carve it into stone. They were doing something to the people who came in there. They were doing something to their minds. In a labyrinth where the third level's passages have no documented end, what is in the sealed portion of the third level of the Hal Saflieni hypogeum? Is there a fourth level below the third? What happened to the people who went in there in the early 1930s? And if the oracle's room was a machine for altering consciousness, what was the altered consciousness for, and what did it make people willing to do inside this place? From the Stone Age depths of Malta, we cross an ocean to the largest pyramid on Earth, where a team of researchers went into a passage in the 1930s, experienced something that made them flee without reaching the end, and sealed the entrance with concrete before anyone could ask what was inside. Number 2. The Labyrinth of Cholula, 1519, Central Mexico. You are a member of Hernan Cortez's expedition, and the locals have led you to what they say is a sacred mountain. It is very large for a mountain. The sides are too regular for a natural formation, too stepped, too intentional. But there is grass growing on it and trees, and from a distance it looks nothing like what it is. The priests who maintain the site meet you at the base. Cortez's interpreter explains, through a chain of translation, that there are passages inside the mountain. The priests control access. They know where the passages go. When Cortez's men move to enter the tunnels, the priests position themselves in the way, and when it becomes clear that Cortez is not going to be deterred, the order is given. The priests are killed. Not one of them is questioned first about what is inside. Not one of them is asked to describe where the passages lead before he dies. The men who held the map of the interior, who knew where the tunnels ended and what was at the end of them, are killed before anyone thinks to ask. The Spanish enter the tunnels afterward. They map what they find near the entrance. Deeper in, they find passages that the dead priests had sealed with stone. They note the sealed passages in their chronicles and move on. In 1519, the Labyrinth of Cholula swallows its last people who knew how to navigate it. Its exit has not been found since. This is the Great Pyramid of Cholula, known in Nahuatl as Tlaquihualtepetl, the Made Mountain, and it is the largest pyramid on Earth by volume. Its base covers an area roughly 4 times that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its volume is 157 million cubic feet. From the outside, it looks precisely like a natural hill. A Spanish colonial church, built on its summit in 1594, remains in active use and is visible for miles. Beneath the church, beneath the hill that is not a hill, 5 miles of documented tunnels were excavated by Mexican archaeologists beginning in the 1930s. These tunnels follow passages from multiple construction phases, the earliest dating to approximately 300 BCE, with successive civilizations building over and around the previous structure for more than 1,000 years. The Aztecs considered it a sacred site predating their own civilization and maintained the priesthood that Cortez destroyed. In the 1930s, the exploration teams working on the more remote passages discovered one that was different. The team followed the passage. It descended at a slight angle, narrowing as it went, the air getting colder and noticeably heavier until 3 members of the group independently began experiencing symptoms. They described to the expedition leader in identical terms: severe disorientation, abrupt, intense fear with no identifiable cause, and auditory effects they described as voices or sounds with no apparent source. The expedition leader documented this in his field notes, with the notation that the team had reached a point in the passage at which further advance was not possible due to psychological effects of uncertain origin. The passage was not at its end. The tunnel continued past the point where the team stopped. They did not reach the terminus. They exited and sealed the passage entrance with concrete. The official expedition report attributed the effects to gas accumulation. No gas sampling was performed before the concrete was poured. Here's where it gets strange. Gas causes physiological symptoms: dizziness, nausea, loss of consciousness. It does not cause multiple people simultaneously to hear voices and experience fear with sufficient precision to describe the effects in the same terms independently. The 1930s team described something that sounds less like oxygen deprivation and more like what the Hal Saflieni oracle's room produces at 111 Hz targeted neurological effects. engineered into a chamber by people who understood what specific acoustic or environmental conditions do to human consciousness. The Aztec priests, who died before Cortez could question them, knew what was in that passage and chose not to run when the execution order came. People who are simply guarding a storage room run. People who are guarding something sacred don't. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 2010s found chambers beneath the pyramid that do not correspond to any identified construction phase. These chambers appear to predate the earliest known construction period by several centuries, meaning they existed before the first pyramid was built above them. The pyramid was not the original structure. Something was already underground. Someone later built the world's largest pyramid on top of it. The sealed passage that defeated the 1930s team leads, ultimately, toward those older chambers. The radar shows where they are. Nobody has been allowed to open the concrete and follow the passage to find out what's inside. The mainstream explanation frames Cholula as a layered construction site, unusual but not impossible. The 1930s psychological effects were gas-related, a phenomenon documented in enclosed ancient spaces. The ground-penetrating radar anomalies are interesting but require study before interpretation, but the execution of the tunnel keepers before interrogation is the fact that everything else circles back to. That was a decision. Someone under Cortez's command decided that killing the priests immediately was preferable to questioning them first. Either that decision was made in haste, in which case it was one of the most costly intelligence failures of the conquest, or it was made deliberately, in which case someone already knew what was in the tunnels and preferred that knowledge stayed in the tunnels. What is in the concrete-sealed passage that the 1930s team fled before reaching its end? What are the pre-pyramid chambers the radar found, and what is inside them? What did the Aztec priests know about the tunnels that made dying at the entrance preferable to revealing the contents? And what, at the end of that passage, produces voices in people who haven't reached it yet? From Mexico's sealed tunnels, we travel to central Turkey, where an underground city, built for 20,000 people, has doors that only lock from the inside, and where the passages below level 18 have not been entered in 60 years. Number 3. The Derinkuyu Underground City. 1963. Derinkuyu, Cappadocia, Turkey. A man renovating his home knocks through a wall during plumbing work and finds a passage on the other side. He follows it down. Cool air. Smooth carved walls. The passage opens into a room. The room connects to another. That room has a staircase. He descends. More rooms. He descends again. He finds a space with carved stone posts that he recognizes as animal tethering fixtures, a stable, cut from rock, underground. He goes down a third staircase. He is now, by rough estimation, 50 feet below the surface of his kitchen floor, inside a structure that should not be here. He finds what looks like a massive stone wheel propped against a wall, 5 or 6 tons of volcanic tuff, shaped into a disc with a hole through the center, fitted into a groove carved in the floor. He pushes on it experimentally. It rolls. He understands in that moment exactly what it is. This is a door. It rolls across the passage to seal it. The hole is for a spear, to kill whatever presses against the far side. But the operating mechanism is entirely on his side of the wheel. If this door is rolled closed from where he's standing, no one on the other side can open it. You can only exit this level if you don't seal the door. If you seal the door, you've locked yourself in. The man goes back up and reports the discovery. Turkish archaeologists arrive and begin mapping. 18 levels later, they stop. Not because the structure ends. Because below level 18, the passages descend into flooding and collapse that nobody has entered since the initial survey in the 1980s. This is the Derinkuyu underground city, and its defining feature is not its depth or its capacity, but its exit architecture. The stone doors that seal each level from below can only be operated from the interior of the sealed level. This is a structure where exit was not a right, it was a choice made before the door was rolled. Once the door closed, you were inside until someone on the inside chose to open it. If everyone on the inside was dead, the level stayed sealed. If everyone on the inside chose to stay, the level stayed sealed. From outside, you could press against the stone and insert weapons through the spear hole and achieve nothing. The 5-ton wheel in its carved groove simply holds. Derinkuyu extends through 18 confirmed levels to a depth of approximately 280 feet. Archaeological estimates suggest it could have housed 20,000 people. It contains stables, wine presses, oil presses, storage rooms, churches, schools, and water wells drawing from an underground water table. The ventilation system is a network of shafts drawing fresh air to every level, an engineering achievement sophisticated enough that modern HVAC engineers who have studied it cannot identify how the designers calculated the airflow. Requirements without fluid dynamics. Mathematics not available in antiquity. Connecting tunnels run from Derinkuyu toward Keimakli Underground City, 5 miles north, and toward at least 4 other underground complexes in the region. The full extent of the tunnel network has never been mapped. Teams that have attempted to follow the connecting passages to their ends have consistently encountered collapse, flooding, or both before reaching a terminus. Here's where it gets strange. The passages at level 18 descend further. A Turkish archaeological survey, conducted in the 1980s, documented this in official reports and noted that the lower passages were inaccessible due to collapsed sections and partial flooding. The survey concluded that the extent of the structure below level 18 was undetermined and recommended follow-up investigation. That investigation has not been conducted. The Turkish government controls excavation permits for the Cappadocia region under strict archaeological preservation protocols. No permit for deep investigation below the currently accessible levels of Derinkuyu has been issued to any research team, domestic or international, since the early 1970s. 50 years of permit denials for a site whose lowest levels remain literally unknown. Artifacts recovered from the lower confirmed levels during initial excavation in the 1960s were catalogued and transferred to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara. Researchers who have examined the catalog find entries for material from the deepest excavated sections that are marked as received but not displayed and not available for general scholarly review. What those objects are and why they are neither displayed nor accessible has not been publicly explained by the museum or the Turkish Archaeological Authority. The mainstream explanation for Derinkuyu is that it was a defensive refuge against the Arab raids of the 7th and 8th centuries CE. The stone doors are military architecture. The depth protected inhabitants from siege tactics. The tunnel networks connected allied communities. The structure was used intermittently as a place of last resort during periods of intense external threat. But no army requires 18 floors of carved volcanic tuff and doors that only lock from the inside to survive a siege. Surface fortifications stop armies. You build underground cities when surface fortifications are not enough, when the threat comes from somewhere or something against which walls and soldiers are insufficient. When you need 280 feet of stone between yourself and what's looking for you. The doors that seal from inside create a structure with no forced exit. If you went in and sealed the door, and the people who could operate the door from inside were gone, there was no exit. That was the design. Not a flaw. The design. What force required 20,000 people to seal themselves 280 feet underground, behind doors that no one outside could open? What does the passage below level 18 connect to, and why has no permit been issued in 50 years to find out? What are the sealed catalog items from the lower levels? And what would it mean if the exit to the deepest level was never used, because the people who went in never came back up? From the city built to seal itself from the outside world, we sail to a Greek island where the most magnificent labyrinth ever described was specifically engineered with a different problem. Not how to keep people out, but how to ensure that anyone who entered could not find their own way out. Number 4. The Lemnos Labyrinth. The island of Lemnos, ancient Greece. You are inside, and you have made a mistake. Not a careless mistake, you took every precaution. You brought a lamp. You brought a rope tied to a column near the entrance. You memorized your turns, but the columns are moving. Not violently, not loudly. The pivot mechanism is so precisely balanced that the brushing of your shoulder against one sets it rotating slowly in the dark. You glance back, and the column that was on your left has turned 30 degrees, and the gap between it and the next column is now slightly narrower, the angle slightly different, and the rope tied to the entrance column is still in your hand, but it's angled in a direction that no longer matches your memory of where you came from. You follow the rope back. You reach the column it's tied to. It is the right column, you can see you're not. But the entrance is not where it was. The passage continues past the column in a direction you do not recognize. You stand still for a moment and think through this carefully. You entered from the north. You turned left twice. You are now standing at the column you tied your rope to, and the entrance to the north is behind a wall that was not there before. You are not getting out tonight. This is the Lemnos Labyrinth, and its defining engineering achievement was a single specific impossibility. The exit could not be found by anyone who didn't already know where it was. Pliny the Elder described it in Natural History Book 36 as the greatest of the three great labyrinths, exceeding even the Egyptian labyrinth at Hawara and the Samian labyrinth in complexity and craft. He wrote that it contained 150 columns, each balanced on a pivot so perfectly engineered that a child could set them turning. He described dark chambers and passages of extraordinary intricacy, and no structure matching this description has ever been found on the island of Lemnos. Not a column, not a pivot socket, not an entrance. The greatest labyrinth Pliny documented has left no physical trace in the centuries of excavation conducted on the island where he placed it. The 150 pivoting columns are the key. They are not decorative. They are not architectural flourish. You do not install 150 self-rotating columns in an underground passage system for any purpose other than to change the visual relationship between the visitor and the walls. Every time a column rotates, every time you brush past one in the dark, and it turns 10 degrees, the corridor changes. The gap you walk through on your way in is now narrower on one side and wider on the other. The doorway you noted to your left is now framed differently. Your spatial memory, which is how all humans navigate enclosed spaces, is being systematically disrupted. The Lemnos Labyrinth was not a labyrinth in the sense of complex corridors. It was a machine. Its purpose was not to confuse. Its purpose was to ensure that finding the exit without guidance was not possible. The exit existed. It was simply inaccessible to anyone who didn't carry the knowledge of how to find it despite the columns. Here's where it gets strange. Lemnos was the sacred island of Hephaestus, the god of the forge, the divine craftsman who built the mechanisms of the gods in an underground workshop, who was thrown from heaven and landed on Lemnos, and whose presence was associated specifically with volcanic fire emerging from the earth. The Cabeiroi mystery cult operated on Lemnos for centuries. The Cabeiroi were not a minor religious group. They were one of antiquity's most restricted mystery religions. Their initiatory rites, conducted in underground sanctuaries, under conditions of extreme secrecy. Herodotus, who described the religious practices of dozens of cultures across the known world with scholarly detachment, refused to describe the Cabeiroi rites. He wrote simply that the uninitiated were forbidden from knowing, and that he counted himself among those who would not violate that prohibition. Herodotus, a man who described human sacrifice, ritual cannibalism, and the secret practices of Egyptian priests, drew the line at the Cabeiroi on Lemnos. When Christian imperial authorities began suppressing the mystery cults in the late Roman period, the Cabeiroi initiates, who still held knowledge of their sacred sites, did what mystery cultists across the Mediterranean did. They concealed the entrances, passed the locations through oral tradition in closed circles, and accepted the prohibition on writing it down. The sites were not abandoned. They were sealed and hidden, accessible only to initiates who knew not just the location but the operating principle of the 150 pivoting columns. When the last circle of initiates that held that knowledge ended, the location of the exit and the location of the entrance went with them. The island of Lemnos controls access to the Dardanelles Strait and has been a military zone for significant portions of modern history. Archaeological excavation has been restricted or interrupted by military activity repeatedly. The island has been less thoroughly surveyed than comparably sized Greek islands. But military access restrictions don't explain the absence of any physical trace of a structure that Pliny described as the greatest labyrinth in the world. A structure of that scale leaves foundations, debris, pivot sockets in stone floors. Nothing has been found because the Cabeiroi initiates were very good at making things unfindable. Their entire religion was built on the principle that some things should not be accessible to people who don't know the way. Where is the Lemnos Labyrinth, and what does it look like now that the columns have been still for 1600 years? What happened during the Cabeiroi rites that required death oaths and a machine specifically engineered to prevent exit without guidance? Who was the last person who knew how to find the way out? And what was at the center, the place you could only reach if you understood how not to follow the columns? From the Greek island where cult initiates engineered an exit that no uninitiated person could find, we move to northern Italy, where Rome's most careful scholar recorded that people actually went into a labyrinth without a thread and confirmed, firsthand, that the exit was not findable. Number 5. The Labyrinth of Lars Porsena, Rome, 1st century CE. You are Pliny the Elder, and you are copying from Marcus Terentius Varro, the most careful scholar Rome has ever produced, a man whose facts do not drift. What Varro recorded about the tomb of Lars Porsena of Clusium you write down word for word, and one sentence stops you. The underground passages, Varro wrote, are so complex that no one who enters without a ball of thread to mark their path has ever found the exit. Not that the passages are difficult, not that the passages are numerous, that no one has found the exit, past tense, applied to everyone who has ever tried. This is not an aesthetic description of elaborate architecture. This is a warning from someone with direct knowledge, preserved in the most trusted scholarly source you know, about a structure where the exit is not findable by normal means. You include the sentence in your natural history without elaboration. You do not appear to think it requires any. You are describing, in the work that will survive 2,000 years, a place people went into and did not come back out of, and in 2,000 years, no one will find it. This is the Labyrinth of Lars Porsena, the only labyrinth in the ancient record where the failure to find the exit is explicitly documented in the primary source. Pliny preserved Varro's description in Natural History Book 36. Lars Porsena was king of Clusium, modern Chiusi, Italy, around 508 BCE, the most powerful Etruscan ruler of his era. He laid siege to the early Roman Republic. His tomb, described by Varro and recorded by Pliny, was built to announce permanence. The above-ground structure was described as a square base, 300 feet on each side, 50 feet high, with 5 bronze pyramids on top, and a bronze disc and trumpet mechanism above those, a structure so visible it could be seen for miles, and generated noise that carried further still. Beneath it ran the labyrinth, underground passages so intricate that Varro, sourcing people who had been inside, reported that exit was impossible without a guiding thread. That thread detail is the most disturbing thing Pliny recorded about any building. You bring a thread to mark your path when you know in advance that retracing your route will be impossible. This is not the architecture of tombs. Tomb builders don't design their creations to trap mourners. This is the architecture of something that was not intended to release what entered it. The Labyrinth of Lars Porsena was built to contain something, and to ensure that containment was permanent. Whatever went in did not find a way back out. Here's where it gets strange. The area around Chiusi is saturated with Etruscan archaeology. The hills surrounding the town contain hundreds of documented burial chambers, painted and furnished, architecturally intact, excavated and catalogued over 200 years of investigation. The civilization that carved those chambers was entirely capable of building a massive underground labyrinth. The foundations of a structure 300 feet square don't disappear from limestone substrate. And yet across 2 centuries of concentrated excavation in exactly the region Pliny and Varro identified, nothing matching the description has ever been found. Not a wall, not a passage, not a hinge point for a bronze column, not a fragment of the bronze model that Varro described sitting atop the pyramid. The most explicitly documented labyrinth in classical literature, the only one whose no-exit quality is a recorded fact, not a mythological embellishment, has produced 0 physical evidence at the site where it should be. The Etruscans were not careless about their secrets. Their language, Etruscan, belongs to no known language family and was not fully understood until the 20th century. Their priestly specialists, the haruspices, who read the will of the gods and maintained the sacred geography of Etruscan sites, operated in closed initiatory circles and held knowledge never committed to writing accessible to outsiders. The haruspical tradition included a specific practice. When political conditions required it, they concealed sacred sites, not abandoned them, concealed them, redirected streams, collapsed entrances, buried markers. When Rome absorbed Etruria, the haruspices, who still held knowledge of Porsena's site, went underground in the literal and institutional sense simultaneously. They did not write down where it was. They passed the location through oral tradition, held in closed circles, until those circles ended. The bronze model that Varro described, a miniature of the labyrinth, mounted 300 feet in the air atop the pyramid, implies that the labyrinth was mapped. Someone made a blueprint detailed enough to reproduce in metal. That blueprint existed. the bronze model existed. Both have vanished with a completeness that suggests deliberate removal rather than attrition. The mainstream explanation reaches for natural process. Centuries of farming, medieval construction, and river activity reshaped the landscape. Porsena's tomb was a burial mound exaggerated in the retelling. The no-exit description is rhetorical flourish, not engineering documentation. Varro's source was a traveler's exaggeration. But Varro didn't include travelers' exaggerations. He was the man Romans called the most learned of all Romans. His source for Porsena's tomb was specific enough that Pliny cited it directly. The no-exit sentence is too functional, too specific, too actionable to be rhetorical. It is the sentence of a person who knows because people tried. What did they find inside Lars Porsena's labyrinth that required no exit as a design principle? Where did the haruspices hide the entrance when Rome arrived? Where is the bronze model that once sat above it? And what did those people who went in without a thread, the ones Varro reported, the ones who didn't find the way out, what did they find at the center before the passages closed around them? From the labyrinth, where the failure to find the exit is explicitly documented, we cross the Mediterranean to the island, whose name gave labyrinths their name, where the only person in legend who found the exit needed a ball of thread, and where the archaeologist who excavated the site poured concrete over the lower passages and called the case resolved. Number 6. The Labyrinth of Knossos, Crete, 1900 CE. You are Arthur Evans, and you have just bought a hill. Within 3 years, you'll have uncovered over 1,000 rooms on multiple levels, and within a decade, you'll have spent more time inside the lower passages than you are comfortable discussing. The lower passages are the problem. The above-ground palace makes sense: throne room, storage magazines, frescoed corridors, but the lower levels, cut from the living rock beneath the palace, don't follow the same logic. They bend. They double back. There are staircases that reach landings with no apparent destination. There are doorways that lead to rooms with no other exit. 2 of your crew members, documented in your expedition diary for the 1902 season, entered a lower passage and did not emerge from the end you expected. They emerged, after 2 hours, from a different corridor entirely, on the other side of a wall that, according to your drawings, should have been solid stone. You redraw the map. The new version is classified in your personal papers as preliminary. It will remain preliminary for the next 120 years. You will eventually pour concrete over these lower levels and call the matter resolved. This is the Labyrinth of Knossos, and the word labyrinth may have been born here. It comes from Labyrinths, the double-headed axe, the supreme symbol of Minoan religious authority, which appears carved and painted on virtually every surface of this 1,300-room palace complex. The double axe was not decorative. It was a statement of what the space meant. And what it meant, 3,500 years ago, was that you could enter and the exit was not guaranteed. The myth makes this explicit in a way that historians tend to treat as allegory and should probably treat as a blueprint. The labyrinth was purpose-built to contain something at its center. Sacrifices were sent in regularly, the Athenian tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens, delivered to Crete on a black-sailed ship. Nobody sent in ever came back. The only person who navigated it successfully was Theseus, and the detail that matters is the detail everyone skips over. He brought a thread, tied it to the entrance, and followed it back out. You do not bring a thread unless the exit is structurally impossible to find without one. The myth is not describing a building where you get confused. It's describing a building where the exit is an engineering problem that kills you if you can't solve it. Arthur Evans excavated Knossos from 1900 to the 1930s. Beginning in the 1920s, he began reconstructing large sections of the palace in reinforced concrete restoring columns, rebuilding entire upper floor levels based on his interpretation of the evidence. The reconstruction is now considered one of the most controversial acts in the history of archaeology because the concrete was poured directly over original stonework. In the lower levels, this had a specific consequence. Passages that Evans's team originally entered are now physically inaccessible, enclosed within reinforced concrete that cannot be removed without destroying the reconstruction. Some of the lower corridors documented in Evans's early expedition records before the reconstruction began simply cannot be reached anymore. They are inside the walls. Here's where it gets strange. Evans's personal papers are held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Most are accessible to researchers. Certain sections, corresponding to the 1902 to 1905 excavation seasons when the lower levels were first mapped, require institutional permission to review. Researchers who have applied for this access describe the process as slow and inconsistently applied. The sections in question contain what the catalog describes as preliminary mapping records for the sub-palace level preliminary records that Evans apparently never finalized into published form across 30 years of active excavation in a site he controlled completely. The Linear A tablets found in the basement storerooms compound the problem. Linear A is the primary writing system of Minoan civilization, found on hundreds of clay tablets and ceilings recovered from the palace. It has not been deciphered. After more than 124 years of sustained effort, including input from the same community of researchers who cracked Linear B and decoded the Enigma cipher, Minoan writing remains unreadable. We do not know what the Minoans wrote about the labyrinth, because we cannot read what they wrote. Whatever is on those basement tablets, sealed in a language no one has broken, concerns a palace that was specifically designed so you could get in and not get out. The mainstream explanation is benign. The labyrinth myth reflects Greek misunderstanding of a large, Bronze Age administrative palace. Evans's concrete reconstructions were conducted in good faith with the methods available. His unfinalized preliminary records are simply incomplete field notes. Linear A will eventually be cracked. The lower passages that confused Evans's crew were simply confusing, not impossible to navigate, merely unfamiliar. But the myth is too precise to be a misunderstanding of a palace. It includes a specific navigation solution, the thread, which implies specific knowledge of the navigation problem. You don't encode a solution in a foundational myth of your culture unless the problem it solves is real. And the corridors that Evans's team entered through one side and exited from the other through a wall that Evans's own maps showed as solid stone aren't a matter of simple confusion. They're a matter of something being wrong with the maps. What did Evans's crew find in the lower passages that the preliminary records describe and the published accounts do not? Where do the basement corridors that now sit inside concrete walls actually go? What does the Linear A text say about the structure it was found inside? And who decided that the best response to a labyrinth that defeats navigation is to fill it with concrete and call the case closed? From the labyrinth whose exits Evans sealed in concrete, we travel south to Egypt, where the father of history was physically stopped at the entrance to the underground level, and where every expedition since has found the same thing, not the entrance and not the exit. Number 7. The Labyrinth of Hawara, 450 BCE. The Fayum Depression, Egypt. You are Herodotus of Halicarnassus, and you have just spent 3 days inside the most complex structure you have ever entered. 12 roofed courts, 3,000 chambers, 1,500 above ground, passages that curve and double back and intersect until you've lost count of where you started. You've been following guides at every turn because without them you couldn't retrace a single step. When you try to memorize the route for your notes, the route defeats you. The passages are not complicated in the way of poor design. They are complicated on purpose. Whoever built this wanted you to lose your way. But you're above ground, and your guides know the way out. So eventually you emerge, blinking, into desert light. Then you learn there is a second labyrinth directly below the one you just walked. 1,500 more chambers, descending into the earth beneath your feet. You move toward the staircase. The priests are already there. They step into your path, and they do not move. The underground rooms, they say, hold the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles. No foreigner enters. You ask how far down the passages go. They don't answer. You ask whether anyone who enters without a guide could find the way back out. They don't answer that either. You leave Egypt with detailed notes on the upper labyrinth and no notes at all on the lower one, because no outsider has ever been inside it. That was 450 BCE. Since then, the situation has not improved. This is the Labyrinth of Hawara, and the 1,500 underground chambers described by Herodotus have never been entered by a single modern researcher. Not because nobody has tried, because nobody has found the entrance. Herodotus walked the entire above-ground labyrinth and confirmed it was exactly as described by earlier travelers. Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Pliny the Elder all visited in later centuries and added details confirming Herodotus's account. The structure was real, its scale was real, and below it, according to every ancient source who witnessed the above-ground portion with their own eyes, was an equal and sealed underworld that no outsider was allowed to enter and no ancient writer ever described from the inside. In 1888, British archaeologist William Flinders Petrie excavated the site near the modern village of Hawara. He confirmed the location, found the foundation outline, and discovered a dense pavement of limestone chips covering the area, evidence of systematic Roman-era demolition of the above-ground structure. What he did not find was any access to the underground level. No staircase, no shaft, no entrance, no collapsed chamber ceiling, no sign that 1,500 subterranean rooms had ever existed or been demolished. The upper labyrinth had been stripped to its foundations. The lower labyrinth had simply vanished. Here's where it gets strange. In the 1990s and early 2000s, ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted at the Hawara site. The results found anomalies at depth consistent with subsurface structures. The surveys concluded that further investigation was needed. That investigation has not happened. Access to the site for non-Egyptian research teams was restricted beginning in 2001. Two separate Belgian research teams who applied for survey permits between 2002 and 2008 were denied without explanation. A more recent proposal to conduct non-invasive seismic mapping of the subsurface, a technique that wouldn't disturb a single stone, was rejected by the Egyptian Antiquities Authority in 2015. The restrictions went into force after the anomalies were detected and have not been lifted since. The mainstream explanation is orderly. Roman quarrying removed the above-ground structure completely. The underground chambers were shallow storage areas, misunderstood by ancient visitors, and subsequently dismantled in the same quarrying effort. Herodotus was prone to amplification. The radar anomalies are geological formations. Nothing unusual is buried at Hawara that isn't adequately explained by natural deposition. But Herodotus was not misled about the above-ground structure. Petrie confirmed it. The same passage that accurately described the 1,500 rooms above also described the 1,500 below. You cannot selectively trust half a reliable witness, and the priests who physically blocked the staircase were not protecting empty storage. Ritual guardianship of that intensity, maintained consistently across centuries by multiple independent travelers' accounts, protects something that must not be seen. The access restrictions that arrived years after subsurface anomalies were detected are not a coincidence. They are a decision. 1,500 underground chambers, described by the most careful traveler of the ancient world, confirmed indirectly by every subsequent visitor, located precisely by a British archaeologist in 1888, and completely unlocated by every expedition since. No team has found the entrance. No team has found the exit. No team has been allowed to look long enough to find either. What do the radar anomalies reveal at depth that has not been published? Why were survey permits denied after anomalies were found and not before? What were the priests protecting below that staircase in 450 BCE, and who is protecting it now? And what would it mean if the exit to the lower labyrinth was never built? From an underground labyrinth where the entrance has never been found, we leap across the world to China, where 36 caves hidden under flooded ponds for 2,000 years are connected by passages that dive teams have followed until their air ran out without ever finding the end. End quote. Number 8. The Longyu Caves. June 1992. Zhejiang Province, China. Farmer Wu Anai has been pumping water out of a pond for 17 days. The pond was supposed to be a few feet deep. The pump is still running. On the 18th day, the water level drops low enough for Wu to wade in, and what he finds beneath him is not the bottom of a pond. It's a ceiling. Carved stone ceiling, vaulting upward into a space so large his lamp doesn't reach the far wall. He stands in the receding water, and his light catches column after carved column extending into the dark around him. He has uncovered a single cave the size of a building. Then his neighbor drains his own pond. Another cave. Someone drains a third pond. Another cave. By the time archaeologists arrive, it's clear that the 36 ponds distributed across this stretch of Zhejiang Province are positioned directly above 36 connected underground caves that no living person knew existed. Divers are brought in to map the flooded connecting passages between the caves. They go in. Their oxygen runs out before they find the end of the tunnels. They come back. They try again with longer air supplies. The passages keep going. Where the connecting tunnels between the 36 Long U caves ultimately led has never been determined. No expedition has found the end. This is the Long U cave system, discovered in 1992, at least 2,000 years old, and one of the most completely undocumented large construction projects in the entire archaeological record. The 36 caves cover a combined area larger than 30 football fields. The largest individual cave measures approximately 100 feet high at its peak and 430 feet at its widest dimension. Every surface of every cave walls, columns, ceilings, floors is carved with parallel chisel marks at a consistent 60-degree angle, applied in uniform bands across thousands of square feet of stone. The precision of these marks across such scale requires either a level of organized labor coordination that should have generated imperial records, or a method of carving that does not correspond to any known ancient technique. No tools were found inside any of the 36 caves. This is not a detail that mainstream archaeology has adequately addressed. Quarrying operations leave debris, broken tools, discarded handles, accumulated stone chips. The caves were apparently cleaned before they were sealed. And they were sealed. The 36 ponds are not a natural formation, they were engineered. Water was deliberately introduced into the cave system after construction, and the surface was maintained to ensure the flooding remained stable and the caves remained invisible from above. Someone built 36 enormous underground chambers, cleaned them, flooded them, and covered the water with what appeared to be ordinary agricultural ponds. Then the historical record was closed. Here's where it gets strange. China, during the period indicated by the cave's Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, maintained extraordinarily detailed state records. Imperial construction projects were documented with the names of supervising officials, the numbers of workers, the costs, the durations, the completion dates. A project requiring the organized labor of thousands of people over years in this region would have required an imperial decree, which would have generated archive documentation, which would have generated regional record copies. None exist. Not a single document in any archive, Chinese or otherwise, references the construction, use, or flooding of the Long U caves. The omission is not explained by poor record survival. Chinese administrative records from this period are among the best preserved in the ancient world. These caves are missing from the record because someone removed them from the record. The diving expeditions conducted since the 1990s have mapped the accessible flooded tunnels connecting several of the caves. The tunnels descend. In at least 2 documented cases, dive teams following connecting tunnels reached a depth at which their oxygen supply required them to turn back before reaching any terminus, a wall, a chamber, a surface access point. They returned to try again, and the second attempt also failed to find an end before the air ran out. The passages connecting the Long U caves go somewhere. No expedition has yet had the equipment or the permit access to follow them far enough to find out where. The carved symbols on the cave walls add a further layer. Some surfaces contain markings that do not correspond to Han Dynasty Chinese writing or to any writing system identified from the region and period. Archaeological teams have been studying them since 1992. No interpretation has been published by any team with institutional affiliation. A government-affiliated research team published a preliminary report in 2001 describing the symbols as under active analysis. No follow-up has appeared. The mainstream explanation is that the caves were stone quarries. The parallel chisel marks are consistent with ancient quarrying technique. The absence of records is an artifact of poor preservation specific to local administrative documents. The ponds formed naturally as groundwater filled abandoned quarry voids. The diving results are inconclusive due to equipment limitations rather than genuinely impassable passages, but quarries don't have columns. Quarry operators don't clean their sites before abandonment. And groundwater, filling a void, doesn't produce 36 ponds of consistent depth, positioned directly above 36 connected underground spaces at regular intervals across a specific geographic area. That requires engineering. Someone decided the water should stay in. Where do the connecting passages between the 36 Long U caves ultimately lead? What are the symbols on the walls? And why has no interpretation been published in 30 years? Who flooded these caves? Who maintained the flooding? And what were they hiding below 2,000 years of water? and why, when the ponds were drained and the caves found, were the first dive teams stopped before reaching the end. From underground caves where dive teams ran out of air before finding where the passages end, we return to the ancient Greek world, where a 19th century expedition entered a passage beneath an island sanctuary and came back out from a direction that the maps said was a solid wall. Number 9. The Labyrinth of Samos. The island of Samos, Greece, 1882. You are a German classical archaeologist named Ernst Fabricius, and you have come to investigate a reference in Pliny the Elder, one of the three great labyrinths of antiquity, described as containing columns and dark passages of particular complexity located on this island. The Eupalinos Aqueduct Tunnel is already well known. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for something else, something separate, something that Pliny distinguished from the tunnel in the same passage of natural history where he listed all three labyrinths together. You find, below the sanctuary of Hera on the island's southwestern coast, an entrance to a lower structure. Stone steps descending. You take your lamp and you go in. The passage runs straight for some distance, then turns. You follow the turn. The passage runs straight again, then turns in the same direction. You count the turns. After 7 turns, each one in the same direction, you calculate that you should be pointing back toward the entrance, but the entrance is not there. You are somewhere else, in a passage that should not exist given the turns you've taken, and your lamp is burning lower. You and your assistant make the only sensible decision, and work back toward the surface by feel, marking the walls as you go. In Fabricius's published notes from the expedition, this passage is described as anomalous. The notes contain one line that is not repeated in any subsequent summary. The passage did not behave as a passage should. This is the Labyrinth of Samos, the most completely invisible of Pliny's 3 great labyrinths and the one with the most unexplained expedition history. Pliny listed it explicitly alongside the Hawara Labyrinth and the Lemnos Labyrinth as a structure of matching significance. He described it as containing columns and dark chambers. Herodotus, writing before Pliny, named Samos as containing 3 of the greatest works he had ever seen, alongside the mole and the aqueduct tunnel. The labyrinth is the third. It is not the tunnel. Pliny describes them separately. They are not the same structure. The academic consensus that the Eupalinos Aqueduct Tunnel is Pliny's labyrinth is convenient and probably wrong. The tunnel is a single straight passage, engineered for water conveyance, dug from opposite ends of a mountain with a small offset in the middle. It is a remarkable piece of ancient engineering. It is not a labyrinth. It has 2 ends, both known, and a single passage between them. If you enter one end with a lamp, you will exit the other end in roughly 20 minutes and find yourself exactly where you expected to be. This is the opposite of what an ancient traveler would describe as a labyrinth, and the opposite of what Pliny placed in a list alongside structures specifically chosen because they defeat navigation. Here's where it gets strange. Fabricius was not the only researcher to enter the lower structure beneath the Herion. A French team surveying the sanctuary grounds in 1894 documented entering a passage at the same location and following it until it divided into 2 branches. They followed the left branch, and it terminated in a sealed wall. They returned to the division and followed the right branch, and it also terminated in a sealed wall. But when they returned to the division point to exit, the passage behind them, the one they had entered from, appeared different. The angles were not the same. The ceiling height was not the same. They found their way out eventually by following the wall with their hands in darkness when the lamp gave out. The 1894 report describes the passages as producing spatial confusion disproportionate to their visible complexity, which is the specific language of a structure designed to disorient. Samos was the birthplace of Pythagoras, who remained on the island until approximately 530 BCE before fleeing the tyranny of Polycrates, the ruler who commissioned the island's great building projects, including whatever Pliny later identified as a labyrinth. Pythagoras founded a mystery school whose central discipline was sacred geometry, the mathematical principles governing space, proportion, and their effects on human consciousness. A labyrinthine underground structure designed to disorient through spatial manipulation is exactly the kind of site a Pythagorean mystery school would use for initiatory purposes. Pythagoras left Samos. He took his knowledge with him. What he knew about the passages below the Heraeon and what they were for left the island with him and was never recorded in a form that survived. The Heraion sanctuary grounds remain only partially excavated. German and Greek archaeological teams have worked the site for more than a century. The area where Fabricius and the French team entered their respective passages has not been fully surveyed with modern ground-penetrating radar. The Hellenic Ministry of Culture controls excavation permits for the site. No permit for deep investigation of the sanctuary's subsurface has been issued to a foreign research team since 1997. The mainstream explanation is that the aqueduct tunnel is the labyrinth, full stop. The anomalous passages Fabricius and the French team described are natural fissures in the limestone, misread as constructed passages by researchers working in poor light. The spatial disorientation is the result of unfamiliar underground conditions, not architectural design. But natural limestone fissures don't contain turning passages with consistent spatial relationships. They don't terminate in sealed walls. And two independent research teams, working a decade apart from each other, in the same location, both reporting that the passages did not behave as passages should, that is not a coincidence born of poor lighting. What is below the Heraion on Samos? Why does the passage that Fabricius entered not follow the spatial logic a passage should follow? What did Pythagoras know about the structure below his home island, and what happened to that knowledge when he fled? And why have two recorded expeditions gone in and come out of the wrong side? From an island labyrinth where the passages disobey their own geometry, we return to Egypt where a French archaeologist entered a gallery in 1851, saw a chamber opening ahead of him in the lamplight, and then the ceiling came down before he could reach it. The chamber has been sealed ever since. Nobody knows what's inside. Number 10. The Serapeum of Saqqara, 1851. The Desert Plateau of Saqqara, Egypt. Auguste Mariette is inside the third gallery. He entered it 2 days ago from a side passage off the main eastern gallery, following a direction his field notes describe as northwest. The tunnel is cut from solid limestone in the same style as the galleries he's already mapped 9 feet wide, ceilings high enough to walk upright, perfectly dark beyond the reach of his lamp. He follows it for a considerable distance. He notes in his journal that it continues further than the other galleries, descending at a slight angle. He notes a widening in the passage that suggests a chamber ahead. Then the rockfall happens. Not a catastrophic collapse. A section of ceiling, loosened by the weeks of excavation activity overhead, gives way in a slow grind of limestone that fills the passage behind him with rubble faster than he can clear it. Mariette escapes forward and eventually finds a second exit he hadn't known about. He is unhurt. But the third gallery is sealed. His notes record everything up to the point the ceiling fell. They do not record what was in the chamber. He could see ahead the widening in the passage, the suggestion of space beyond. He intended to return. He never did. Auguste Mariette died in 1881, and the third gallery of the Serapeum of Saqqara has not been entered since. Whatever is in that chamber, no one has seen it. This is the Serapeum of Saqqara, and it is the labyrinth where the objects inside it are physically impossible to have arrived. Mariette discovered the site in 1850 by following Strabo's 2,000-year-old description: an avenue of sphinxes, a buried entrance, an underground complex beneath the desert plateau. What he found inside was consistent across all 25 chambers he mapped. Each contained a black granite sarcophagus of extraordinary scale. Each box was carved from a single block of Aswan granite. Each was 13 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 11 feet tall. Each weighed approximately 70 tons. Each lid weighed 27 tons. The lids fit the box bodies with precision that modern measuring instruments, applied to these sarcophagi in the 20th century, found accurate to within 0.008 of an inch. That is not a measurement achievable with ancient hand tools. That is CNC machining accuracy, replicated 3,000 years ago in some of the hardest stone available. The access tunnels are 9 feet wide. The sarcophagi are 9 feet wide. They don't fit through the tunnels. The mathematics of this are not complicated and have never been resolved. Either the tunnels were constructed around the sarcophagi after placement, but the tunnel stonework is monolithic, no joints, no seams, no evidence of reconstruction, or the sarcophagi were lowered from above before the tunnels were finished, but there are no overhead shafts above any chamber, and the weight of these objects would require lifting apparatus of a scale that should have left permanent marks in the desert plateau. The sarcophagi are inside a passage system they cannot have entered. Nobody who has studied this problem seriously has provided an explanation consistent with known ancient Egyptian technology. Mariette found 24 of the 25 sarcophagi empty. No remains of the sacred Apis bulls they were supposedly built to contain. No inscriptions on the polished interior surfaces. No organic residue of any kind in most of them. Empty boxes of impossible precision, sealed in alcoves they cannot have been moved into, accessed through passages they cannot have traveled through. The 25th contained bone fragments and gold items that Mariette removed and documented. Those items have not been included in a major museum exhibition since the mid-19th century. Here's where it gets strange. Mariette's private field notes from the 1851 season, including his detailed record of the third gallery up to the point of the collapse, are held in the archive of the Louvre Museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities. They are classified in the archive catalog under a restricted access designation that has been in place since the notes were deposited. Researchers who have requested access to this specific catalog section describe the approval process as non-functional applications are acknowledged but not resolved. What Mariette wrote about the third gallery, including his description of the chamber widening he observed ahead of the collapse, has not been published in any scholarly work. Nobody knows what he saw in the lamplight at the end of that passage before the ceiling came down. In 2022, a team from Cairo University announced that ground-penetrating radar surveys had detected chamber anomalies at depths of 30 to 45 feet in the area immediately adjacent to the known Serapeum galleries. The chambers do not correspond to any mapped section of the existing complex. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority was notified. No excavation permits have been issued for the detected chambers. The announcement was covered briefly in archaeological press, and then went quiet. Imhotep, the architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara around 2650 BCE, was later elevated to divine status by the Egyptians, one of the only non-royal individuals in Egyptian history to be deified. His tomb has never been found. Researchers who have studied the Saqqara Plateau believe it lies somewhere within the unexcavated sections of the complex. Some believe it lies in the area adjacent to the Serapeum. Some believe it is below the currently mapped gallery level. Nobody knows, because the excavation permits for the most likely areas have not been issued. 10 labyrinths. 10 different civilizations, 10 different centuries, 10 different continents and cultures, and in every case, the same answer at the bottom of the investigation: the exit has not been found. Some because the entrance was blocked before anyone reached it. Some because the passage collapsed before anyone reached the end. Some because the doors were designed to seal from the inside. Some because the columns were designed to make retracing your path impossible. Some because the expedition reached a point inside and came back without finding what was at the end, and afterward someone poured concrete or restricted the permit or sealed the archive. The pattern across 10 civilizations and 5,000 years is not coincidence. Something was put inside these labyrinths that was not meant to come out. The most disturbing question isn't what it was, it's whether it's still there. If this one kept you up, subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Like if any of these 10 made you genuinely uneasy. And drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from, because these labyrinths are on every continent, and so are the people who are still making sure the exits stay sealed.